Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dale, and today we have ourselves a brand new set of patch notes featuring a bunch of class buffs and only some nerfs for the patch 11.17 Season 2 content, as they're continuing to balance out our classes for the rest of Season 2, which is about to get a massive boost when it comes to endgame progression and gearing, which should get more players into the high-end endgame content. It looks like they're trying to tune some of the classes, especially some of the ones that have been underrepresented, but also toning down some of the ones that are overrepresented, both in PvE and PvP endgame pieces of content. As you can see, however, this is quite a long video and there's a lot of changes for us to go over, so I kind of wanted to dive into it as soon as possible, and I will leave chapter marks down below so you can skip around to all of the most relevant sections that you're interested in the most. But with that, as always, if you guys want to keep up with all the regular updates for Season 2 content or War Within patch 11.15, or if you're interested in future updates for patches like 11.17 currently on the PTR, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. We love to see even more class tuning, and hopefully they'll continue to do additional changes, especially for any specs that are like heavily underperforming, just so that everybody has a good time with this season, especially with them, releasing a big boost to gear very soon. It's going to be an opportunity for so many players to get into seasonal content, and I'm just hoping they end up amping up the weakest classes. Of course, maybe we'll see more nerfs to the strongest, but definitely hopefully we'll see some buffs to anything that's underrepresented. Starting with the class of Death Knight for this set of changes, the Sunland Death Knight has been renowned slayer of dungeons, probably some of the best, if not the, actually it is the best melee DPS class for Mythic Plus dungeons by far. Part of it is the Sandland Blood Beast, or Blood is Life ability. That summons a Blood Beast that explodes, and depending on how much damage you do with your abilities, the Blood Beast accumulates a portion of it and explodes to all enemies around you. With the talent of Pact of Sunland, you actually get to store more of that shadow damage that you do into your Blood Beast for when it explodes, which allows you to deal some absolutely insane amounts of damage. Though it looks like that aspect, they're actually starting to nerf a little bit, which is kind of like the bread and butter as to what makes Death Knights super strong right now in keys. So they're actually changing this by quite a bit. Instead of storing 50% of all shadow damage dealt, it's now going to be down to 25, which is a considerable nerf overall. A little unfortunate to see. I don't think it's going to be enough to dethrone Death Knight as one of the best playstyles for melee for Mythic Plus whatsoever, but it does definitely put a cap into some of their potential AoE damage. However, you do get some of the benefits for single target and raid content, but also maybe an opportunity for you to play back with your mages again, as Death Knights don't play a pet build whatsoever when playing Sunland. You're all about diseases and shadow damage, not about summoning pets whatsoever. So I think they're trying to sweeten that deal a little bit. Like Mages of the Dead that you get to summon with Doom Biddings, their Frostbolt ability is now going to do 40% more damage. I think this is to encourage potentially Apocalypse, which can spawn more Mages of the Dead more consistently and have them start to cleave with Shadow Bolts at 4 nearby targets. Although Mages has cast 2 spells, one of them is a Shadow Bolt, the other is a Frostbolt. The Frostbolt, from what I can understand, is mostly single target, while Shadow Bolt is the cleave component. So if anything, it's a little bit more single target damage primarily. They're also buffing the damage of Raise Abomination, increasing its overall output by 30% to try to make that a little bit better. So overall, it seems like decent bit of buffs for raiding and some nerfs for Mythic Plus, but for the most part, nothing too major. Next, we got Havoc Demon Hunter, starting with a 4% damage buff all across the board, which is not the most exciting one of the buffs out there, but it is still vital. Like we saw with Arcane Mages, that got buffed one week by 4%, another week by 8%, and a couple of talent changes here and there. And like in a very short time, they went from like really underplayed Mage spec to like overlap in Frost as well as Fire pretty quickly in the Mythic Plus meta. So even small buffs like this for just raw damage can still go a long way, which is going to be one of those things helpful for DH and overall. Also, and I guess I'm not even sure why I'm Felskard in this build, Aldraka Reaver does get a nice little quality of life improvement, primarily when it comes to positioning your Demon Hunter within raid content specifically. You see, the Reaver's Mark ability that is getting cleaved or getting applied from your Chaos Strike or from, I believe it is your either Fracture or, I'm pretty sure it's Fracture as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. But the Reaver's Mark application can technically be parried sometimes if, let's say, you're fighting the boss from a front. So normally you want to be behind the boss or behind the boss. This is primarily concerning raid content, but to increase some more consistency for Demon Hunters, they're actually making it so the Reaver's Mark can never be parried ever again for both Vengeance and Havoc. So this makes it a little bit more overall consistent and a much needed quality of improvement for some of these different specs. Demon Hunter is not the only one that gotten some of these quality improvements as well. Assassination Rogue is another one that's got a very minor one over the last week or so. So it's actually just a very little nice addition. Then we have the class of Druid starting with Guardian, which is very similar to Veda's Demon Hunter, or Havoc Demon Hunter rather, is also getting a raw damage buff of about 5%, which is kind of nice because there are actually some compositions that do use Guardian, especially to some of the high-end, top-end, M+ content. So this should give him just overall more damage, but also technically a little bit more healing, since you have portions where some of their damage can actually convert into raw healing, so that is also going to benefit him as well. Feral Druid is another one of those specs that's also seen a bit of a tune-up, which is kind of surprising because they're actually a really good melee for M+ content, but there is even a nice one, a 3% damage and auto attack ability increase. Normally, when you're just increasing classes like ability damage, it doesn't mean all the abilities, you know, a portion of your damage comes from trinkets or maybe embellishments or other types of procs as well. So this raw 3% ability and auto attack increase actually ends up accounting for a little bit higher than it would for most classes, so it's actually a decent bit of a gain. Then we have the spec of Restoration Druid, which is mostly seen at PvP change specifically. Their mana regeneration is being reduced slightly from originally 70% value down to 75% reduction. So it's a slight mana adjustment, I think, to account for some of the overall longevity and healing within arena PvP content. From there, we have the class of the Evoker, and they're continuing to buff Aug yet again. For how many weeks has it been now? It's been multiple weeks of them trying to buff up augmentation. They initially removed augmentation from the meta completely, heavily reducing its overall support gameplay of Ebonite and Prescience and some of its group buffing benefits, but they have been really keen on trying to buff its damage. So they're actually buffing the damage of all spells of augmentation by 15%. So you're not buffing Ebonite, you're not buffing Prescience, you're not buffing the effectiveness of your Breath of Eons, I don't think. I think you're just buffing the raw overall throughput. I guess in a way kind of marching them towards becoming a proper DPS class, while the buff mechanics are actually taking a bit of a backseat. I wonder if at some point Blizzard's just going to pull the band-aid and make Aug a proper DPS class, maybe with some very tiny buff mechanics, kind of like, let's say, like, you know, a Paladin can place a Blessing of Sacrifice on an ally, or a Shadow Priest can use Vampiric Embrace to heal allies for a short moment. You know what I mean? Maybe that's what they'll end up doing with augmentation at some point, make it less of a buff class and more a DPS with some buff capabilities, but I guess time will tell exactly what they do with this spec in the future. Besides this, the Preservation Evoker is receiving some new buffs for PvP content, specifically when it comes to a handful of talents that they get to play into. Like a talent of Time of Need that basically allows it to have a cheat death mechanic for an ally. They're actually no longer reducing its healing by 25%, giving you overall better emergency healing. Also, Energy Loop that normally would generate you a little bit of mana, normally that would be reduced in PvP heavily, it no longer has its mana cost or mana regen reduced by 25%, so if you want to play a little bit more aggressive with Preservation, beaming targets down with Disintegrate while recovering some mana, that's probably going to be a little bit better of a playstyle. As well as the healing of Verdant Embrace also gets increased by 15% on top of it, which is huge. Not only is it a big burst healing ability, but also because it synergizes with their tier set that has a shorter cooldown, and it also applies insurance to targets, so that becomes a lot more burstier of an overall heal. Another class spec that's receiving some buffs is Frost Mage, specifically as the Spellslinger, which is a hero spec that's actually been taking a bit of a backseat. While popular for Arcane, hasn't quite became this as popular for Frost, with Frostfire really being like its core viable option. But they're trying to make Spellslinger a little bit better. First of all, the entire Splinter mechanic, the Splinter damage, is being increased by 10%, which seems a little bit sizable. With the talent of Controlled Instinct, they're increasing the damage to 40% of Splinter damage instead of 30%, so with the damage increase of Splinter, plus also the residual damage as well, it actually looks like a fairly sizable AoE increase. As well as the talent of Volatile Magic's damage is also being increased by 25%. So they're trying to make the main mechanic of the Splinters a little bit more effective, which I think is kind of cool. I really like the whole resets for orbs with Spell Frost teachings for Spellslinger in Frost in particular, but I also like how for Arcane it enhances like the basic mechanics of the spec. For Frost it would be the Shatter mechanic, so it's really cool to see them try to at least buff it up, and hopefully it'll become a slightly more viable option going forward. Up next, we have the class of Monk. We were primarily seeing PvP changes specifically for the Mistweaver Healer. First of all, Mistweaver's mana regen is getting buffed up a little bit. Instead of reducing the mana regen by 40%, it has now only been reduced by 35%, so a little bit more meta all across the board. Also, the PvP talent of Feather Feet, which is kind of fun, you may now cast while moving during Lighter Than Air, and its duration is now 6 seconds. Lighter Than Air being the talent where once you roll, you get a buff of Lighter Than Air for a few seconds, which allows you to double jump to dash, but if you don't use the dash in PvP, you can actually use it to cast while on the move. They're actually increasing the duration to 12 seconds to try to make it a little bit better. Technically, monks don't really need a lot of movement while casting, but it may be nice for you to be able to apply Soothing Mist in order to be able to weave behind a pillar and then channel a bunch of heals once you have the tether of Soothing Mist to that target, so maybe there'll be some value there. They also make it so the Jade Serpent statue becomes a little bit more effective, increasing its healing by 60% and the duration from baseline, I think it's 8 seconds down to up to 14 seconds. So it should hopefully be a little bit more effective when it comes to range healing, but also the increase in the base healing of abilities like Vivify by 20%, so quite a decent sizable gain for Mistweavers when it comes to PvP content. Now, another class that's getting buffed up is the Paladin, started with the Retribution, and they're really giving Retribution some amps right now. Blade of Justice being buffed up by, I want to make sure I get this right, 80%. This is a very basic, very bare bones holy power builder, and they're buffing it by quite a decent bit. Also, the Capstone Divine Arbiter, which takes a while to stack up, that damage has been increased by 50%, which allows your abilities to slowly stack up a buff over time. That just unleashes a powerful strike doing a bunch of single target damage, plus also AoE damage to all enemies around you, so that's a sizable increase. Plus, we are seeing a 10% damage buff on your final verdict, your primary holy power spender, which is a raw single target damage increase, which is definitely nice to see. However, outside of that, Red Paladin and Holy Paladins are also receiving some PvP adjustments as well. Like for Retribution, the talent of Luminance, the PvP talent, will now increase Lightbearer's healing by up to 150% instead of 200%, so it has a little bit of this like less splash healing that is provided to the Paladin. The cooldown of Blessing of Sanctuary for Retribution is also being increased to 60 seconds rather than 45, so that means a slight loss on the utility uptime. And for Retribution as Herald of the Sun, when you play the talent of Gleaming Rays, they're actually reducing the Holy Power spender damage by 10% rather than 15%, so a slight adjustment as for Herald of the Sun Paladin. As for Holy, they're actually buffing what I feel like is somewhat of an underused talent of Denounce, which replaces Shield of the Righteous. Definitely a talent that's not quite as strong as it was back during Warlord's General days when it was quite popular, but it's an ability to replace your Shield of the Righteous with a range cast that calls down the light, dealing damage to the target, preventing them from being able to crit for the next 8 seconds. So it's almost like a damage suppression component to it with critical strikes, which can be good in some cases. From there, we have the class of Priest. We're starting with Holy, which is a very, for the most part, underrepresented healer this season. And they're trying to, looks like, buff it up just by a little bit, increasing its overall healing output by 4%. This doesn't necessarily do anything in terms of changing the issues with Holy or fixes any specific playstyle issues that they may run into for Mythic Plus or raiding. It's a nice increase, and I think sometimes that can be kind of good in some cases, but likely will need a little bit more than that. But yeah, Holy's at least getting a bit of a healing buff all across the board. However, those of you that PvP as Holy will see your mana regen reduced slightly. They're actually reducing your mana regen instead of by 50%, they're increasing that by 55%. So that number is going to be a little bit more impactful when it comes to your overall resource spending. From there, we have the class of Shaman, which is primarily receiving a number of PvP changes, starting with a talent available for all 3 specs, which is Electrocute. When you successfully purge a beneficial effect, the enemy suffers nature damage over 3 seconds. Normally, this number isn't all that big, but they're buffing it by 75%, I think to try to allow you to be a little bit more aggressive with your purges. So together with Instacast Lava Burst as Resto, or maybe as a Elemental, even purging an enemy will count as a damage and ability, which maybe could be kind of good. A very unique mechanic that I think this is the only class that has something like this, like a punishing purge type of element behind its gameplay. You know, outside of maybe mages, which can literally steal a beneficial buff instead. From there, we primarily got PvP changes for Resto, starting with Torrent, which is actually going to have its initial bonus to Riptide Heal is now 100% increase in PvP, which was initially reduced by 33%, but now it gains its full value instead. Also, big news for Shamans because they're actually increasing the health of your Healing Tide totem for PvP combat, increasing its maximum health by 75%, which is huge. It does mean that Healing Tide is likely to stick around just a little bit longer than it usually does because it normally gets killed off very quickly, so it might be a little bit easier for you to get full value out of your major healing cooldown. And they're also helping them out with mana as they are reducing their mana regen from normally 65% reduction up to 60% reduction. So they're actually giving you a little bit more mana regen to play out within arenas and battlegrounds. From there, we have the class of Warlock, which is primarily going to be getting more changes for the spec of Affliction, mostly within PvP combat. And for Affliction, these are some kind of good changes. Normally, with the talent of Rampant Afflictions, you're able to spread your unstable afflictions to multiple targets, but its damage is reduced by 60%. They're actually pulling back on that damage reduction and then reducing the damage only by 45%, so you're actually looking to get a little bit more value when spreading UAs across an entire enemy team, which is actually going to offer you quite a bit of additional pressure. They're also trying to make those UAs, even though now they're going to be a little bit more deadlier, they're trying to make sure that they have a little bit more of staying power. So the backsplash damage of dispelling an unstable affliction, that is actually going up by a decent bit, increasing its damage by 20%. And the ability itself does a lot of damage on its own over time, but has a pretty big, ginormous bursty effect when it does get dispelled by the enemy caster. So it is going to just allow Affliction Warlocks to execute just a little bit more pressure than before. Next, we have the class of Warrior, where both Fury and Arms will actually share one simple update that is going to be to buff up the Slayer playstyle of the specs. So they have the damage increase to a Blade Storm, which is going to be 30% for both of them, which plays really well with Slayer. On top of it, not only they're increasing the damage of your Blaze Storm, but also the momentary Blaze Storm you get with Reap the Storm, increasing its damage also by 30%, so all of that Blaze Stormy goodness just gets amplified by a decent bit. Outside of this, for PvP, we are seeing some slight adjustments for both Fury and Arms. Starting with Arms, they're actually increasing the baseline damage of your Execute by 20%. However, if you play Arms as a Slayer Warrior, there's a bit of a synergy with Execute and the talent of Show No Mercy. Marked for Execution increases critical strike chance and critical strike damage of your next Execute on target by 15%. So they're actually reducing that down to 5% instead, which on its own is going to still be a decent bit of a game, but they're basically trying to give you less of this bursty, out of nowhere, out of the blue proc executes, but are trying to supplement you with more raw damage of executes to complement it. So less of a spiky damage, but you overall do gain quite a bit of more value within PvP. As for the spec of Fury, they're actually going after the talent of Slaughterhouse, which has been their main way to be able to put up some anti-healing pressure on an ally, or rather on an enemy, since they don't have Mortal Strike, so they have to stack it up over time. Rampage, Onslaught, and Nolan's Fury will reduce the healing of the target receives by 3%, stacking up to 12 times for 20 seconds. They're actually reducing the duration of this one down to 12 seconds, so it does mean that Fury is going to have a little bit of pressure falling off over time, which is a little bit unfortunate. Also, Fury Warrior's variation of Show No Mercy also sees the same reduction as it does for Arms, increasing its critical strike chance and damage by 5% instead of 15%, though no execute damage amp to complement it. And when you do play Mountain Thane, the talent of Strength, or rather Strength of the Mountains, it will now increase the damage of your Bloodthirst and Rampage by 25% instead of 37% that it was initially in PvP combat. So a slight reduction for Slayer and a slight reduction for Mountain Thane to, I guess, bring down a little bit of pressure that a Fury Warrior is able to output within PvP content. And with that being said, as always, I don't want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this quick little update, or at least as quick as it possibly could be. As always, if you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciated. Join our Discord community to keep up with all the regular class updates or patch notes in the future, but also with all the new changes for the patch 11.17. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.